He is the politics reporter for the Daily Beast. He is author of Trust the Plan, The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America. Will, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We've read so much of your reporting over the years on this program. And I think, you know, our audience is probably as well-versed in Q-ness as some will come. But there was a lot that I learned. First off, one of the things I did not realize is where the adrenochrome, where that came from, or how it got popular. Let's just tell us the story of adrenochrome, because I think, like, on some level, it gives hint to how, to the nature of how this started in some way. I think, like, not literally, but like how the Q conspiracy started.
Sure. So yeah, QAnon believers think that the world elites torture and sexually abuse children, eat them in satanic rituals so that they get this substance in their heads with their pineal glands called adrenochrome, and you drink it and you stay young forever. But the backstory here is that this all goes back to Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where Hunter S. Thompson writes, you know, he's making up all these drugs he's taking, and his lawyer says, well, here you go. Here's this drug called adrenochrome. You can only get it from a pedophile. And so that's where it comes from. I mean, so it's really how many, like, a hall of mirrors that it ends up, you know, motivating all these crimes and January 6th and all this crazy stuff.
But how much of it is also like a derivation of the stem cell freak out, or like the anti-abortion stuff as well? I mean, there's this very evangelical tilt to the conspiracy theory, which is this fixation on the purity of children, that I think has this religious touchstone.
You know, Emma, I think that's a great point. I hadn't even considered the stem cell aspect to it, but certainly thinking back to those debates during the Bush administration, all that, this idea that children are being, like, rendered down, you know, to keep old people alive. I mean, that's really a great point. I think that probably plays into it. I mean, so much of the stuff is not like there's a direct line, but it's these kind of like psychic tropes and these emotions and stuff like that. So I think that's definitely part of it.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit, because I want to circle back to a lot of that stuff about the religiosity associated with this. But let's start back to its beginnings, because I think, like, if there's somebody out there, I mean, and I think we can all agree that it's not real. Okay, I mean, let's just start with that. Like, I mean, maybe there's some disagreement, but let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that none of this is real, that somebody started this as a lark, right? There's no way you start something like this and think, like, you know, maybe L. Ron Hubbard thought this, but like, I'm going to do this as a lark and see if I can start my own religion or whatnot. But the idea that this sort of, like, one of the linchpins comes from a Hunter S. Thompson writing suggests to me that this is somebody who was like, this was like just a prank, right? I mean, give us a sense of like what you understand as being, you know, who was the original Q and how it grew and what the original intentions were.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of who's behind Q, who kicked it all off, I mean, I think it's we haven't seen it proven conclusively, but I think there's a lot of good arguments that it was originally this guy named Paul Ferber, who's a programmer in South Africa, and maybe some people working with him. And these are people who are themselves really deep into conspiracy theories. But basically on 4chan, where Q originated, there was this history of people pretending to be leakers. And so they'd say, I'm the Hollywood leaker, I'm the FBI leaker. And everyone would say, you're lying, get out of here. To the extent that one guy actually did leak military secrets on the board legitimately, and everyone said, you know, get out of here, loser, whatever. But so Paul Ferber tries this on in this theory, and he's trying to spread the word about the conspiracy theories he believes. And then it sort of just gets out of hand to the extent that, you know, he can't come out and say he's Q because it's supposed to be Don Jr. or Dan Scavino. So he just has to say, like, I'm Q's best friend. You know, and kind of trying to associate himself with it. And then ultimately, according to this theory, which I find pretty credible, it's stolen by the guys who run 8chan, who, this is in the HBO QAnon documentary. QAnon gets kicked off of 4chan, ends up on 8chan. And then these guys say, oh, you know, maybe we should keep this for ourselves. And they basically hijack it.
And you keep it for yourself because it's like it's a good marketing ploy.
Yeah, I mean, it brings people to their website, which I think, aside from, it's also a big place to post for mass shooters to post their manifestos. But otherwise, no one goes there. And so I think these are also just mischievous guys. I mean, Ron and Jim Watkins, they seem to love messing with people, and what better way than QAnon?
Do you think that there's they're messing with people? Are they just messing with people who are going to believe this stuff, or was there any type of ideological I mean? I have to say, I would be lying if I didn't think at times, I have had ideas to do something similar to this. I mean, it was more like I would figure out how to directly monetize it. Like I was, going to do the real Obama is not giving you, and it ends where he's not giving you single payer healthcare. But for the entire movie, I could sell that, on Alex Jones or something like that. Do you think that they were specifically choosing did they have any type of ideological desire to mess with certain people, or was it just sort of we're just going for the most messable people?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are right-wing guys who are particularly the father, Jim Watkins. I think is very steeped in American far-right ideology. I mean, he tried to launch this news website, news. I say lightly here, called the Goldwater, and of course Barry Goldwater. I mean, this is a guy who's kind of calling back on these old kind of boomer conservatism tropes. So I think they saw it as and obviously they deny being behind it, but I think they saw it as sort of the ends justify the means sort of way to radicalize more people in America.
And his son ran for Congress, right?
Yes.
In Arizona. But trolling is ideological. The way that they troll is in the same vein as, I would say, the way white supremacists, or in that shooter who was targeting the gay nightclub in Colorado came out and said, "Oh, I'm non-binary," and then we didn't hear anything about it, right? And to me, that was just a classic 8chan, 4chan, alt-right online troll move where you're trying to goad people into stepping in it, right? And there's a whole brand of kind of antisocial online right-wing, typically young male people who go to these kinds of sites who enjoy that, right? It's almost like a philosophy of messing with people. It's pretty antisocial, but I think there's a connection there with the Watkins and how they run their site.
Yeah, I think it's very similar. I mean, you mentioned these white supremacist sort of 4chan campaigns. You think of the doing the OK sign thing, which obviously not everyone doing the OK sign is white supremacist, but then they'll use it that way. I mean, in the case of Jim Watkins, I met him while I was reporting on the book, and he's wearing pizza socks and he's got a Q pin. And so I said, "Oh, is this a reference to Pizzagate?" And he said, "Well, what are you possibly talking about?" Or, I've never heard of QAnon. I mean, this kind of very bald-faced lying that is sort of a real-life trolling.
But what's the value? I mean, I don't understand trolling in that way. Do they think they're radicalizing? Because I think in terms of a political movement, I'm a little bit, and it's disturbing that a significant portion of the country believes this stuff. But I'm not convinced it necessarily helps the right wing ultimately if, people are going down this rabbit hole, because, I mean, at one point there's going to be blowback that Marjorie Taylor Greene is, assistant speaker of the House practically at this point. I mean, do you get the sense they think it helps their political ideology to have people out there going RFK is, JFK is going to, Junior is going to show back up somewhere? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a case of it's sort of getting away from them. I mean, I think perhaps they saw it as advantageous to have people think Hillary Clinton ate children. Maybe this is going to radically get some more votes. But I agree with you. It's not a great look to have a couple hundred people wandering around Dallas, looking for Tupac or JFK or as you say, I mean, for Marjorie Taylor Greene to be such a prominent figure in the party, then you can look up her talking about Jewish space lasers and stuff like that.
It's what you say, Sam, right? It's about there being value in saying something publicly to the broader audience, right? Where they're saying, "Oh, we would never believe in this," but then they have their own in-group language, and that's activating. This is just a more extreme version of what you would say Limbaugh does.
Well, I mean, and I know, Will, you grew up as a Limbaugh listener.
A ditto head, yes.
Yes, I did not, but not. I did not subscribe to it. But he was the sort of, I guess, the innovator of a lot of this stuff about, like, Clinton and Vince Foster and drag the body into the park and that type of thing. And it makes a lot more sense in the context of they thought they were creating that, and it just kept going. And that's what it feels like a little bit. And what I also found amazing, and I sort of like maybe have seen it in bits and pieces, but to see it in one place, the status of some of the people who believe in this. Michael Flynn was like extremely powerful in our government. Ginny Thomas, Marjorie Taylor Greene, these people seem to be true believers.
Yeah, I mean, I just had a story in the Daily Beast last week about the woman who helped Maria Bartiromo and Sidney Powell create the Dominion thing that obviously has landed Fox in this lawsuit. And she, to be frank, was a total whack job. I mean, it was all based on her one email, and this is the email where she says, Antonin Scalia was murdered in a human hunting expedition, all this stuff. And so it's really striking. You mentioned the Ginny Thomas text where she's texting Mark Meadows and saying, I saw this video about how, they're going to ship all these people, all these Democrats to Guantanamo Bay. And just the line between just like utter whack job internet person to some of the most powerful people in our government, I think it's striking how really thin it is.
Well, I mean, you do a lot of reporting on families where, somebody has gone across that threshold. And, and more often than not, or I guess, well, I don't know. I mean, you tell me. More often than not, are the family just sort of horrified? Because I'm thinking in terms of Ginny Thomas, like the most charitable view that one can have is that Clarence Thomas gets home from the Supreme Court every day from work, and Ginny's there, and she's like, "You're not going to believe this," and what are the chances that we can go to this rally where JFK is going to show up or something? And he's just like, "Oh gosh, this is really sad," or like, how much is his worldview influenced by this? Like, that's the thing, right? I mean, but you saw other families. Tell us like what your sense is of how this works in other families. So what the sort of like, I guess the range of possible reactions at the Thomas dinner table is.
Yeah. I mean, it really does range in a lot of ways, as you say. I mean, I followed a family for a year as their son, who was in his 20s, got into QAnon. And it always starts with sort of a remark that you go, like, wait a minute, what'd you say? In this case, the son came in and said, Dad, I want you to be prepared. A lot of celebrities are going to get arrested soon. Oprah, Tom Hanks, they're going to Guantanamo Bay. And the dad said, well, I hope it's not Tom Selleck because I like him, and kind of laughed it off. And then, cut to a year of his kid getting more and more into QAnon. I talked to a woman whose husband got insanely into QAnon. He got addicted to coke because he wanted to stay up all night in case, a QAnon clue arrived. He'd have to stay up. He started having affairs with all these QAnon believers because he felt so isolated that his wife didn't believe in it. So, I mean, it gets pretty crazy. So I think it's a great point to think about what Clarence Thomas's home life is like. And, you kind of have to wonder, especially for someone who's so conservative himself, it's kind of hard to imagine that he's saying, oh, that's crazy every single time.
Yeah, I really wonder about that. I mean, because they've had, she's like in the past, like during, I can't remember when it was, but Ginny Thomas was like sending letters, still holding on to the hearings, angry at the testimony against Clarence Thomas. And if I remember correctly, this is like within the past decade, I feel like. I really wonder what that dynamic is, because if Clarence Thomas believes a fraction of what it seems possible Ginny Thomas does, that seems really about as disturbing as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, these text messages, she thinks that, Democrats are all going to be rounded up and arrested. And so, I mean, when then it comes to the Supreme Court being asked to rule on the election, stuff like that, I mean, it's definitely disturbing.
Give us a notion of like how much this like, why do you think this caught on in the way that it did. I mean, because some of it does feel, well, so much of it is like there's religious iconography. Like who is the person that's most susceptible to this? Because I mean, I think like my theory is that if you've already got, are in deep on some type of fundamentalist religion, making that shift over to Q or into some deep spiritual, it doesn't necessarily have to be a, organized religion, that your mode of thought is open to that.
Yeah, I mean, just to, since Emma mentioned the religious aspect earlier, I mean, it is huge. The overlap between evangelical Christianity and especially Pentecostalism and QAnon is huge from what I've seen. I mean, when I go to these QAnon events, they'll do these, very charismatic religious things. They'll do the altar calls. People will do speaking in tongues. And I think, an aspect of that is this idea of modern day apostles or prophets. So you have these people who say, well, my prophecy is that Donald Trump will be elected in 2016 or these various things. And so if you already buy into that, it doesn't seem like that big a leap for a lot of these people to then say, well, maybe there is this Q guy who is, sort of telling me about this secret war with the devil. So I mean, the religious thing is huge. Initially, people getting into QAnon tended to be kind of like a Trump rally crowd, older, whiter, because it was so focused on Trump. But especially with the pandemic, when people got, more people were sort of looking for answers and they had a lot more time online, we start seeing it sort of spread out into younger people, more people of color, more women. So really, at this point, it's often someone who maybe already has something a little weird going on with them, and then they hear about QAnon and then they get all in.
There's the Satanism is fascinating too, because I also think you can connect it to how there's the demonization of trans people right now. There are demons among us. They're trying to go after your kids, make them trans, make them gay, and there's this kind of artificial morality ascribed to like a mission and into belief against fact that you can also tie into, Jesus is coming any day now. Not to make this like a anti-religion thing, but when you go far down that rabbit hole, it's the search for signs, and they've just kind of copy and pasted that onto Donald Trump as the savior in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, they really see that it's so key to the QAnon belief system, and really, like, religion is like we've been talking about, is just right next to that. I mean, you hear people who get into QAnon because of their religion, or people who are brought to Christianity by QAnon, who are not in a church, and then they start hearing so much about the devil and Jesus and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it's so key to the QAnon belief system that, like, the devil is a real guy, a real force, and he's out there in the world and he has these agents. And it's your job as a QAnon believer and as a Christian to, you are on the front lines, you are fighting here. And, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think QAnon has played a significant role in the trans panic and this backlash to LGBT rights, to say that, this idea that they're after the children, I think fits right into that.
How much of a role did Jeffrey Epstein or like what was his impact on like the Q phenomena, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, Jeffrey Epstein was huge for recruiting people in. I mean, even before the charges that culminated in his death, he was kind of a foundational story in QAnon. And then after he died, and look, I'm not saying there wasn't anything weird to that. I mean, when he died,
without doubt,
I thought, like, how dumb do they think we are? I mean, I don't know what happened, but it looked really suspicious. And obviously a lot of people thought that way. And I think for some of those people, that then was used as a gateway into QAnon, where these QAnon believers would say, well, don't you think it's messed up that, Jeffrey Epstein did this? And of course, people would say, of course. And they say, well, let me tell you about the cabal. And so it goes from there.
Well, he's Jewish too, right? That helps, right? That helps the conspiracy theory.
Well, but I think what it does show, though, is like on a structural level, like what QAnon does for its adherents. Like, you have this thing with Epstein, and I think like a lot of people had the exact same reaction that you did, which is like, seriously? Like, the cameras were off, and I mean, I have deep suspicions as to what happened there. But because there's no answer, sometimes it's just like too hard to sort of troll around and live with something that is not resolved. And on some level, it was one of the things that comes in and provides an answer for that question and other questions. I mean, in that way, it functions a lot like religion.
Yeah, I mean, I think when they do studies of people who are susceptible to conspiracy theories, it is often this inability to sort of deal with unanswered questions or contradictions. And QAnon and other conspiracy theories offer a much simpler way of viewing the world, and one that I think can be empowering in some ways, even as it's disempowering in others. Because it says, with the pandemic, for example, or Jeffrey Epstein, rather than there are all these complex factors, there are all these things we don't know. It's just this is a group of guys who did it. They're at fault.
So, like, as a political force, where is Q now? Like, what? Like, do we have any type of data on like how many of these people vote? How many of these people like? I mean, I think it's a problem, and I think well, answer that question. I get some other questions about where this places in history, but do we have a sense of like as a political force, like how big of a deal it is?
Yeah, so I mean, looking at polls, and I like to take sort of the most conservative ones in terms of not like some of the tenets of QAnon, but for people who say yes, I believe in QAnon, they rate between 3 and 7% of respondents. That's millions of people, and when you expand it out to do world elites run a satanic cabal that abuses children, that gets much bigger, and that's in like the teens of people saying yes. Now. Q in late December 2020 told his followers to stop identifying so openly as QAnon believers because I think they were getting banned from social media. The brand had kind of become tarnished. But I think in many ways, QAnon has succeeded in getting this conspiratorial idea of, world elites out to abuse children, maybe through the LGBT rights movement. This idea that the election was stolen. A lot of that stuff has really become mainstreamed in the GOP. And in terms of QAnon itself, Donald Trump is signaling to them constantly on Truth Social. He's posting memes about QAnon and how great it is. So in 2024, I think we might see it surge back. And the one thing I'd add is, he's also gearing up to call Ron DeSantis a pedophile. Trump is sort of laying the groundwork for that. So I could see that fitting right in with a sort of QAnon resurgence.
Do we have like a historical, have we had phenomena like this in history where there was this much of an adherence? I mean, look, I could make the argument that Opus Dei is not terribly different from this. And we have, I think it was Scalia was Opus Dei, and I think maybe Alito might be. And it's possible Thomas. I mean, in terms of reporting, I think there's arguments that, certain religions that are out there also have some pretty wacky ideas that are, but do we have any historical precedents for this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there have been movements based on conspiracy theories before, and certainly elite groups like Opus Dei. But I don't think there's anything with sort of this broad, certainly in American history, this sort of broad base of support that is, not just they believe in conspiracy theories, but they have this moment called the storm that is their big fascist moment where Donald Trump takes over the country. And, everyone lives in utopia if you didn't get sent to Guantanamo Bay. And so, I don't think there is anything like that really sort of activates people and says, you need to
except
bring
for like
about
Christianity.
I was going to say that's the rapture.
Second coming,
yeah,
right? I mean, like, except for the original version of that, which like a huge, it seems to be people subscribing to, but there's no like, there's no sort of like there hasn't been a similar sort of like, are there divisions within Q? Like, are we starting to see like Q denominations?
Oh yeah. Oh, this is some of the most fascinating stuff about it. Is this? I mean, there are all these kind of, as you say, there's kind of like mainline QAnon, and then there's the JFK Jr. crew, and then there's sort of the more extreme JFK Jr. crew, and there's the just people who like see symbols and numbers and letters and all this kind of stuff. And what's fascinating is how they all hate each other. And they say, we are the serious QAnon people. We're the patriot researchers. These guys are making us look like idiots.
But they're all election deniers, right? I mean, in the end, that's what this is. This is what it's become. QAnon is becoming the election denier movement within the Republican Party, which I think is a way to launder the conspiracy kind of thinking for electoral purposes, to kind of go back to what Sam was saying there. But that part of looking for numbers and signs and stuff underneath the surface is fascinating to me because, like all good conspiracy theories, it does provide a simple solution and bad people to answer life's questions and make people feel better. But what it also does is it activates the conspiracy theorists as people who are agents of change in and of themselves. They're little detectives looking for blood libel in this instance or pedophilia in this instance. Like, how much of that is a sense of when you speak to people who are in QAnon, the fact that they have agency over their own lives in politics in particular?
Yeah, I mean, they love it. I mean, it gives you this sense of, that the real truth of the world, as one guy said, that I know the news before it happens. And so even if you have, whether you're kind of a marginal existence or you're just kind of a mundane one that you're bored with, I mean, QAnon gives you this status. It gives you a community. And as you said, I mean, you can go, they call it baking because the breadcrumbs. And so you can kind of go into the clues and research them. And then if you find a particularly good bait, as it were, an explanation for the clues, you're valorized, and you can even make a lot of money, depending how prominent you get in QAnon.
Yeah, you're right about that guy. What was it? Neon
Revolt. Yes.
Yeah. Neon Revolt. Yeah. Tell us about Neon Revolt.
Yeah. So this is a guy who was a failed screenwriter from New Jersey. He had gone out and sort of written some, based on what I read, it's sort of some failed like Kevin Smith knockoffs. And so he comes back to New Jersey. He's living with his folks, and he feels that he got screwed in Hollywood because he was a white man. And he's working in the freezer
This
section.
Sounds like the Ben Shapiro story.
I mean, I think a lot of these guys are, Steven Crowder, like all these guys with entertainment backgrounds. Michael Knowles, obviously in the news. And so, he's working in the freezer section at a grocery store, and he's like, this is my domain. And then he loses the freezer. And so he gets transferred. And so he's just like this guy who's like a very, he feels the world is slipping away from him, and he has like an online girlfriend, and they break up and all this stuff, and then he discovers QAnon. And not only can he, because most of these people can't write at all, and so he has this ability to write these blog posts, but also he can turn them on his old enemies. And so he picks the guy who created the blacklist, the list of these Hollywood screenplays, very powerful executive. And he says,
Franklin Leonard, we should say, is his name,
exactly.
Right?
And so he says, I'm going to get my revenge. And then he writes all these blog posts saying, the king of the Hollywood pedos is Franklin Leonard. And most of these QAnon people, they'd never heard of this guy. And suddenly Franklin, because he didn't pick this guy up from the slush pile or whatever, he's suddenly getting all these death threats and stuff like this.
That's like The Player. Isn't that isn't that the storyline from The Player, from Altman's The Player?
You're right. Yeah, the death threats to the Tim Robbins character. That's a great point.
All of this just seems to be like this sort of low end regurgitated showbiz stuff, but it's just catching on. Well, I'm curious, the different denominations within Q, do they have different names? In other words, it's like, I'm pissed at you because you don't believe fully the version of the JFK Jr.'s returning story that I have. Am I like, how do I refer to me and to someone who also shares my belief to disparage, Emma, who thinks that, JFK he's alive, but he's going to stay on the secret island and he's not going to come back, or whatever the sort of like fundamental differences that we have within Q. How do we have specific like denominative names?
Well, usually they are identified by sort of which QAnon promoters they follow. And so, you might say that, this guy, the Negative 48 group, those are the most hardcore JFK Jr. people, for example. Someone might say, those guys are ridiculous. I follow this Telegram channel, We the Media, or what have you. And it gets so crazy because these people who want to make QAnon respectable, these people who are taking positions in their local Republican parties, it drives them nuts to see people wandering around Dallas saying, there's Tupac, there's Robin Williams. And so, some of these guys end up like me at a QAnon convention going around and, they're a QAnon promoter, but this guy's saying, this guy's ridiculous. I can't believe this garbage. So, I mean, it gets very vicious. And, that's part of what makes the reporting on it fun, because then they'll call me up and say, this guy got arrested and stuff like this.
What's give us a sense of like where we are in the trajectory of QAnon. Like if there was, I mean, you've given us some numbers as to like how many people we're talking about, but if you were to sort of like graph it, where are we on the graph at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, I think certainly sort of the first QAnon era came to an end with Joe Biden's inauguration. I mean, people might say January 6th, but really even after
inauguration.
Well, they say it's being filmed at Tyler Perry Studios in Atlanta. So, they,
that's a black guy.
Well, that's yeah. And so, at the inauguration, obviously there were all these soldiers after January 6th and these fences, and they said, well, that's to arrest them. And I would just say, well, it's because they did January 6th. Like, that's why all the soldiers are there. But after he was inaugurated, they felt, oh no, now Trump can't do the storm. But now, as Trump sort of returns to the public eye, I think potentially we're going to see an upswing. And, it could also happen that we see this reemerge under a new name. I mean, Pizzagate is kind of a QAnon precursor. And that really went away after the shooting at Comet Ping Pong, where suddenly Alex Jones was facing lawsuits. No one wanted to talk about Pizzagate. And then it came back as QAnon. So it may reemerge as something else.
Is QAnon sort of like, if we were to look at, if Pizzagate was sort of a precursor, was the Tea Party also? I mean, the crossover, it seems to me like a very similar cohort of people. And having like interviewed people back then, it seemed like they were on the road to something like this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sam. I think, when you look at who's drawn to QAnon, it is often people, I think, who would have been in the Tea Party movement, if they weren't. I mean, it's very similar. There's a similar kind of like, we're this grassroots army. And they don't like a lot of Republican leaders in the same way that the Tea Party did, that they see them as rhinos and, they're going to take back America with or without them. And so I think it's similar in that way, but it's almost like, I guess the difference is I don't hear a lot of QAnon people talking about lowering taxes or, bailing out the 47% or whatever. I mean, it's almost like the Tea Party movement decided to get something much more visceral. And I think what happened in between there is, we think of the Tea Party in 2010, and then Republicans really get much deeper into conspiracy theories with more birtherism, Jade Helm, stuff like this. And then I think this is the result.
About that.
Yeah, the birtherism is where I think can connect the Tea Party, right? The Obama's secretly born in Kenya. I mean, and you can't convince me otherwise. And there was no coincidence that Trump is at the center of that too, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. And really like a proto QAnon in many ways, in that you had all these kind of wackos emerging from the internet to say, I know the birth certificate's fake and stuff. And, Jerome Corsi was involved in both of them in really the inception of them.
And I mean, that's a good point. I mean, like, and if the president's getting away with being a secret, a secret socialist from a different country, I mean, who knows who's involved in this thing?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And the beauty of QAnon in terms of its appeal is you have all these, you have Jade Helm, you have birtherism, and QAnon gives you an answer for who's behind everything. And any sort of current event you care about, it's the cabal.
Remind everybody about Jade Helm, because this was a big, like, I remember this. It didn't reach this sort of like national fervor, but like it involved like, a huge, like maybe a quarter of the United States was going to be invaded by Obama's special army in Washington or something. Right.
Yeah. So a huge part of the Southwest and Texas, and I think New Mexico and some other states, there's going to be this large military exercise called Jade Helm 15, I think. And conservatives latched onto this to believe that it was essentially an excuse to arrest Republicans and that they were going to turn Walmarts into concentration camps and all this. And it's sort of an early sign of how deep conspiracy theories were getting into the GOP, that the governor of Texas at the time, who I think would have been Rick Perry, was maybe Greg Abbott at that point.
No, but, it was Rick Perry.
Said, I'm putting our National Guard on alert, so that we're prepared if Obama tries to arrest Republicans, we're going to step in and defend Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is.
I mean, Ted Cruz was talking about. I think Louis Gohmert said something on the floor of the House, right? About that.
It certainly seems believable. I mean, it really was one of these sort of early inroads where even Republican leaders were latching onto it.
So where are the Republican leaders on this now? Like, like McCarthy doesn't seem to have any problem. Like, how much do you think Marjorie Taylor Greene actually believes in Q? Or is she, has she gone over to,
Yeah,
she's deep in, right? I mean, she's for real. She's just laying low right now because she knows that she can't do this. But do you think that she still has is she still the same Q fanatic that she was? She just realizes I've got to button this up a little bit.
I think that's right. I mean, we can compare the two kind of pro-Q Congress members of Congress who got elected in I guess 2020. The Lauren Boebert, who definitely kind of nodded to QAnon and I think saw them as a base of voters she didn't want to alienate, but who only is on the record once saying, so they're like, oh, Q, that's sort of interesting. I hope they're right, which is a crazy thing to say. But then you look at Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is deep, deep, deep. I mean, if you look at her Facebook posts, and not just in conspiracy theories, but in terms of Q in general, she's debating like which Q drops are legitimate with this kind of like Talmudic intensity. She's really getting into it. And so the idea now that she's like, oh, I guess I posted the wrong hashtag. No way. I mean, she was in.
I gotta also say, then, since we just spoke about Alex Jones, another way you could view QAnon is the marriage of the birtherism and the rise of conspiracy theories about mass shootings, which she also engaged in, which is crisis actors and things that they're not telling you. I mean, that also feeds into like this kind of frenzy where the internet now became this almost Frankenstein monster where this stuff became self-creating at this point, and whenever Q hit its apex.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, she was deep into this false flag stuff, and QAnon and all these conspiracy theories is sort of a way to avoid seeing what's obvious. So, which is to say, oh, are there too many guns in America? Is it too easy to get guns? No, it must be a false flag, or I look at all these people who get into QAnon because they have all these debts and they've been promised that their debts will be relieved if QAnon happens. And then should they say, well, is it messed up that I am so in debt just because I got ill? No, it must be the cabal's fault.
Interesting. I don't think it's going to get better.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Sam. On one hand, I think in 2022 there were a lot of QAnon people on the ballot who lost. There was a whole QAnon coalition led by one of the JFK Juniors to sort of seize control of elections in battleground states, and they all lost. So that's positive.
That is positive, but I'm thinking, I feel like the trajectory is not necessarily a rosy. I don't think this gets better. I really don't. But Will Sommer, the book is The Plan, The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America. I am afraid that you're going to have an opportunity to write a sequel, but I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.